this presentation by Sam, who I'll introduce in a second, is based on a paper he wrote for an edited volume we are currently still constructing and putting together, which is looking at lessons and insights and information from the 12-day war between Israel and Iran. This particular event, we'll be talking about Sam's report, which we'll be putting into the chat for you all to access, entitled Shallow Ramparts, Air and Missile Defenses in the June 2025 Israel-Iran War. And so with that, I filibustered enough to get a quorum in here. And so, excuse me, what I wanted to remind everybody is that we do like for these things to be interactive. We have all been on Zoom since the pandemic. But what I would like to tell everybody is that we use the Q&A format. So if you have a question that comes to your mind throughout this topic, look down at the bottom, use the Q&A format, type them in there, and I will moderate these questions. If you put it in the chat, I promise you I will not see it. And so please use the Q&A format and monitor the chat for any links that we pop in there. So with that, I'm going to formally introduce our speaker. Today we're talking with Sam Lair, who is a fellow with us here at FPRI in the National Security Program. And he's also a research associate, excuse me, on the open source intelligence team at the Center for Non-Proliferation Studies. And as discussed, we are talking about his paper, Shallow Ramparts, Air and Missile Defenses in the June 2025 Israel-Iran War. So with that, Sam, I'm going to turn the floor over to you for your presentation.
Great. Thanks, Aaron, and I'm really excited to be here today, and thank you for inviting me. And thank you for inviting me to contribute to this volume. This was a subject that I followed very closely while the conflict was unfolding, and I thought it was a really cool opportunity to dig a little bit deeper into some of the analysis that I've been doing on the performance of various air and missile defenses, really since the beginning of the kind of regional conflict and the various True Promise operations that have happened since October 7th. Specifically for the June 2025 conflict, though, I thought that it would be useful to try to develop a more holistic understanding of how air and missile defenses performed, because I think that can provide us with better insight into the dynamics of the conflict, maybe why it came to an end when it did, and then also the relative military capabilities of Israel and Iran, as well as maybe some suggestions about what future regional conflicts might look like. And so I think looking at the performance of Iranian air defenses and then putting that into conversation with how the Israeli air and missile defense system fared will probably increase the quality of the discussion that we've been having about things like Iron Dome and missile defenses for regional conflicts. So I wanted to start with the Iranian case because that helps establish the basis for a lot of the Israeli conversations. And I think that we saw the consequences of catastrophic air defense failure for the Iranians, right? The Israeli Air Force had more or less unfettered access to Iranian airspace for the entirety of the conflict, really limited by the range of their aircraft and the amount of fuel that they had rather than air defenses, right? We saw that there were no shoot downs of any IAF jets. Really, the only thing that the Iranians ended up being able to claim was the shoot down of an Israeli Heron reconnaissance drone, at least as far as I've seen. And then maybe like a clobbered Tomahawk that went awry on its way to target. So there really was no successes for the Iranians in their air defense. And this also is borne out in some ANIC data. If you spent a bunch of time, like I did, watching videos of Iranian air defenses, you basically only saw footage of AAA firing. There were no surface-to-air missiles that were being launched, and you weren't seeing any videos of kills or reported kills from that. And that kind of spoke to the overall trouble that they had, right? They were reduced to relying on those kind of AAA systems. And it's interesting to think a little bit about why this happened. And I think it mostly comes down to battlefield preparation. The Israelis did a really good job of preparing the battlefield, and this started months in advance of the war itself. After True Promise 1 in April of 2024, the Israelis targeted some of Iran's most sophisticated air defenses. So the S-300 systems that the Iranians had purchased from Russia, some of those were taken out by the Israelis, and then similarly, things like early warning radars were also targeted. And this was expanded in the Israeli response to True Promise 2 as well. In addition to kind of targeting the exquisite air defenses, though, the Israelis spent a bunch of time smuggling in and infiltrating small drones, which then were used to destroy other air defenses at the beginning of the war. So the Israelis did a really good job of preparing the battlefield and enabling them to pursue the kind of missile defeat strategy, which ends up being so important. Another thing that's worth mentioning was some work that my colleague Jeffrey Lewis and I did, which suggested that a lot of Iran's air defenses were not only quite old in their origin, but also like diverse and not very well integrated. Based on some footage of an air defense command center at Natanz, it didn't look like early warning radars were communicating very well with the actual shooters, and that could have probably posed some issues for trying to do things like take out Israeli stealth fighter jets. So I think that the kind of diverse or far-flung origins of a lot of Iran's equipment, combined with the really extensive battlefield preparation the Israelis did, meant that they had more or less unfettered access to this airspace, and they could strike targets with impunity. A really good metric for this is that the Israelis had remarkable success hunting transporter erector launchers, right? So there's the famous story about the difficulty the US and the Allies had in hunting Scuds during the first Persian Gulf War. And we saw kind of the reverse of that this time, which was that the Israelis were able, they claimed about 120 Iranian transporter erector launchers were destroyed during the course of the war, which is really impressive considering that I think zero were claimed during Persian Gulf War One. So that delta is remarkable. And I think part of that is because they could just fly wherever and strike whatever they wanted to. I think another part of this is Iran's basing mode failed for their missiles. The missile city concept, where they had dug extensive tunnels underneath mountains, and then they would flush the tells with missiles on them out at the beginning of a conflict. This ended up not working very well if you aren't able to cover the tells as they're moving to their launch locations with air defenses. Um, a lot of the missile cities were either were extensively bombed, and the entrances to the tunnels, the checkout facilities for the missiles were destroyed. And so if you can succeed in kind of bottling up the missiles and preventing them from even leaving their bases, that's pretty successful. And this is borne out in the lack of large coordinated strikes. So in True Promise 2, the Iranians had kind of two closely coordinated waves totaling about 200 missiles. So that was the October 2024 attack. That really strained Israeli defenses, right? About 45 missiles got through Israeli defenses to Israel. And we didn't see during the entire course of the 12-day war a single strike that was the same size as True Promise 2, right? So the Israeli missile defeat strategy was really successful in not only destroying a bunch of missiles on the ground, but then when the missiles got off, preventing those strikes from being large and well coordinated. And so that missile defeat strategy ends up playing a really important role. And it also explains the serious success of the Israeli missile defense system, which I wanted to turn to now. It's kind of unclear just because the data is super muddled, but it seems like about there were 50 or 60 impacts in Israel from about the 500 or so missiles that Iran fired during the war. So that's like roughly 10% getting through defenses. But again, like the data is pretty muddled, and it's hard to have a kind of detailed analysis of the effectiveness because of the duration of the conflict. But there is actually some pretty good data for missile interceptor expenditures, which I wanted to talk about now. So I'm gonna share some slides. There we go. Can everyone see this?
Yeah, I can see it at least.
Well, that's good. Um, so this is a video taken by a Jordanian photographer out in a suburb of Amman, and he captured a ton of the missile defense engagements during the war. So you can see on the left there, those are missile defense interceptors firing out, and then now you can see the Iranian missiles descending as the Israeli terminal defenses start firing. So those shorter range systems back there are probably David Sling or something like that. And then you can see again, these are also missile defense interceptors flying out. And we were able to identify and categorize which interceptors were being used based on a couple characteristics. The most obvious one is staging. So the interceptors that you saw flying out on the right a moment ago, those were Arrow 3s, and we could tell that because you would see the first stage burn out and the second stage would then ignite. And that's the only Israeli two-stage interceptor. Um, Similarly, we were able to distinguish between the single stage THAAD interceptors that the US deployed to Israel and the single stage Arrow 2 interceptors the Israelis use by looking at how long the burn time was. THAAD burns for slightly shorter than Arrow 2, and so we were able to figure that out. And by taking the videos that we have here and then using information like what type of interceptor they were using, where the camera is pointing. We were able to identify a whole suite of Israeli ABM sites or anti-ballistic missile sites that were active during the 12-day war. And so by taking the location of the photography and then drawing rays out across Israel, we were able to pinpoint all of these different missile defense sites, and also to help find the location of the THAAD battery that the US had deployed. And so and we can see these are kind of spread out across Israel. So the video captures a big chunk of the area that was targeted by the Iranians during the missile strikes. And this provided some really useful data. Oh yeah. So we also have some satellite images of some of these particular locations. This is the THAAD battery that was deployed there after True Promise 2. And we can see the 6 launchers as well as some reload sites and then the radar and support area. And then this is the missile defense site outside of Nevatim Air Base. And so by doing things like measuring the size of the shadows, we're able to identify which are Arrow 3 launchers versus which are for the shorter terminal defenses like David's Sling. So we're able to figure out which ABM sites are active based on using the videos and then confirming that by finding satellite imagery of the missile defense launchers that are present. And by collecting all of the different videos that this photographer posted over the course of the war, we're able to track the usage of missile defense interceptors. The THAAD battery is, of course, only firing THAADs, and then a lot of these are only firing Arrow 3s, and then some are firing Arrow 3s and Arrow 2s. One interesting side note is that there was relatively little Arrow 2 use. There was much more reliance on the longer range Arrow 3 interceptor and the THAAD, of course. And there are some important limitations on this data. One is that the photographer was only videoing at night. So any missile defense engagements that happened during the day weren't captured by the videos. A second limitation is that he didn't video every night. So there are some nights during the war where we just have no data whatsoever. I think there are like only 5 or 6 nights that we actually do have data. But it ends up being a pretty representative sample, and the numbers end up being quite surprising. This is also complemented by some really great reporting. The Wall Street Journal had a good article where they got US officials to talk about American missile defense expenditure rates. And when we compare that to the confirmed launches, it ends up tracking really well. So the journal got US officials to say that 150 THAAD interceptors had been used and 80 SM-3 interceptors had been used, which we weren't able to see any SM-3s in the video because those are firing from the Mediterranean, which is a little bit, I think, further than this camera can see. And then if we kind of peg Arrow 3 expenditures to THAAD expenditures and think that they're being used at roughly the similar rate, then we think that maybe about 130 or so Arrow 3 interceptors could have been used. And I think it's worth totaling up how much this could cost. Missile defense interceptors are really expensive. And even the cheaper Israeli ones end up costing a ton of money when you start pricing it out. I think the Arrow 3 is about $4 million each. The THAAD is like 12.7. The real delta in the estimates comes from the SM-3 numbers because the different variants of SM-3 end up costing wildly differently. And so I ended up putting together a kind of a low and a high estimate of how much money was spent on missile defense interceptors during the conflict. And uh, the low estimate, both estimates assume that the kind of US official statements to the Wall Street Journal are correct. And so about 150 THAADs and 80 SM3s were used. But then the difference between the low and high is that the low is the cheaper SM3 variants and the only confirmed Aero 3 launches, whereas the high end is the more exquisite SM3s, so the SM3 Block 2As, and then the extrapolated number of Aero 3s. So this ends up being a very, very expensive engagement from a missile defense perspective. For comparison, the cost of Operation Rough Rider, which was the U.S. campaign against the Houthis earlier this year, cost about $1 billion and it generated like 700 airstrikes. So you can start to get a picture of like how much money this missile defense engagement cost. Though I think the quantity of interceptors used is also really significant as well. For comparison, this is probably 150 THAAD interceptors is probably about 1/4 of the U.S. Stockpile currently. So about 1/4 of available THAAD interceptors were used in 12 days of conflict against Iran. Similarly, it's about 1/4 to 1/3 of available SM3 interceptors were used. A statistic that I found particularly staggering was that about 17% of all SM3s delivered to the United States were used during the 12-day war. So this ended up being kind of incredibly demanding on existing U.S. missile defense interceptor stockpiles. And I think it kind of speaks to how interceptor intensive missile conflict can be when you're trying to defend large areas. So I think I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. So yeah, I think the kind of conclusion that I took away from this is, even if we can't get really good data on how the Israeli missile defense system performed, we can see that it consumed a ton of interceptors. And especially when thinking about how this was not against the best version of the Iranian missile force, right? This was against a kind of severely deteriorated force that had been under continuous attack and was not able to put together kind of large coordinated strikes against Israel. It raises questions about, how difficult that would be in other situations where you don't have the same kind of missile defeat strategy that the Israelis pursued on the table.
So I want to jump in and sort of like, zoom out here a little bit. Can you start with your methods? I know that there's a little bit more story about how you came across that camera in the desert from, I forgot the gentleman's name, but he's a stargazer, correct? So he's setting up his camera to look at the stars, and so perhaps pick up the story from that.
Yeah, so he had my understanding is Zaid Al-Abadi is an amateur photographer. I think he has a day job, and this is kind of what he does in his free time. And he his actually his star photos are quite excellent, by the way. I would highly recommend them. But his video of True Promise 2 got retweeted into my timeline and ended up being a huge treasure trove of information. And in order to really dig into it and extract as much as we could out of it, we geolocated where the video was being taken from. So we figured out, where in Amman the camera was set up, what direction it was pointing. We used the constellations visible in the camera field of view to figure out, roughly the how much of Israel you could see. So we used all sorts of methods to figure out how much we could see from there and where it was. And then that allowed us to really start digging into things like how many interceptors were launched, how did that stack up against reported impacts and things like that. And then during the 12-day war, Abadi ended up posting fairly regular videos. Again, not every night and not during the day, but the kind of quantity and quality of video evidence that he produced is the best that I've seen for thinking about missile defenses during the war so far. So again, it was a really unparalleled source of data. And yeah, it was just total happenstance that we ran across it. But running it to ground was a cool process, a real interesting open source project.
Yeah, so I want to emphasize that this was open source, that this was a video that was widely available, that ultimately became leverage for the data to create for this project. Two, True Promise 1 and True Promise 2 were the missile tit for tats that happened after the October 7th attacks, the strike in Damascus that killed members of the IRGC, prompting Iran to launch ballistic missiles. I think, what would you say differentiates, let's say, True Promise 1, True Promise 2, those first two ballistic missile attacks versus the start of the 12-day war in terms of how we think about missile defense?
Yeah, so this is fascinating. The True Promise One, which is again, as Aaron said, the retaliation for the Israeli strike against the Iranian consulate in Damascus, uh, that was a strike that was composed very differently from True Promise Two and True Promise Three. So the True Promise One attack included a large wave of cruise missiles and drones flying across the Middle East to Israel, and then also about 128 or so ballistic missiles. And based on and none of the cruise missiles and drones made it between, I think, the US, the UK, the Israelis, and I think maybe also the Jordanians. All of those Shaheds and cruise missiles were shot down. The ballistic missile side of this is more complicated, but the US intelligence community officials said that there was about a 50% failure rate of those. So about half of them experienced some sort of malfunction or problem during flight. And my sense was this reflected which missiles were used. I think that the Iranians were kind of bringing old stuff off the shelf. We saw a lot of Shahab 3 variant debris, which is the older liquid propellant missiles that are based on variants of the North Korean Nodong, which is itself based on the Scud. So they were kind of bringing things out, like dusting them off and using those for True Promise One. And I think that explains the high failure rate and also why there were only a handful of impacts across Israel. I think fewer than 10, which is not very impressive. Again, like the Israeli and American missile defense system performed really well against that type of attack. It's worth noting as well that because of the drone and cruise missile inclusion in the strike package, there was also a lot of forewarning. So there was more early warning for the strike on a tactical level than for later strikes like True Promise 2. And it's interesting because we can see the Iranians taking and kind of inculcating the lessons that they learned and then adjusting their strategy. So after the decapitation of Hezbollah leadership, the Iranians launched True Promise 2 in October of 2024. And True Promise 2 was a very different strike package. There was much less warning, and it was only ballistic missiles. It was about it was about 200 ballistic missiles, of which about 20 of those failed during the boost phase, and then about 45 get through Israeli defenses. And they came through in two kind of closely coordinated waves, and they were focused mainly on Nevatim Air Base as well. So the concentration of fire on one target, the short time frame, I think all of these things put way more stress on the Israeli missile defense system than True Promise One had. And especially the kind of coordination of the strike, so that most of the missiles are arriving at about the same time. That prevents the defenses from doing things like reloading launchers. So a good example of this is the Arrow 3 launcher, when deployed, only carries 6 interceptors on it. And so once you've used those up, you have to take the time to pull the canisters off, put new canisters on before that launcher is ready to be used again. And by narrowing the time window of the strike, you remove the ability of the defender to do that. And this is also true for the shorter range defenses like David Sling, or there were even videos of during the war of an Iron Dome interceptor getting an Iranian ballistic missile. So the Iranians learned their lesson from True Promise One. They got rid of the drones and cruise missiles, which just waste everyone's time, and then focused exclusively on the ballistic missiles and making sure that it's a large strike dedicated at just a few areas at the same time. And this was why the Israeli missile defeat strategy was so important to the success of their missile defense during the war, is that it disrupted similar strikes. So by targeting the transporter erector launchers, by bottling up the missile cities at the very outset of the war, they prevented the Iranians from putting together the kind of large massed strike that would have put similar severe strain on their missile defense architecture. And I think that's one of the big differences between them, right? The Iranians learned their lesson after True Promise 1, they adapt, but then the Israelis adapt themselves. It's just that that adaptation requires them to command the Iranian airspace.
I'll just let everybody know, as part of this edited volume, we have a chapter on the actual cruise and drone defense coming out in about 2 weeks. So more on that in terms of how that was executed from the U.S. perspective. But when we talk about what do we know about Israeli magazine depth on Arrow, and particularly Arrow 3? Those are the easiest to identify, as you said. They have two stages, which means they have a booster that boosts it, it drops off, then a second booster that goes, and then those impact outside the atmosphere, and so they look very distinct when you can see them on video. They also, so I guess that's becomes very easy to identify, so that you can begin to make rough calculations about expenditure rates versus magazine depth. So what did you come away with that?
Yeah, so this is way less certain than the US, which is frustrating for an analyst, but I think understandable from an Israeli military defense perspective. The Israelis are not putting out P charts in the way that the US is, which makes it more difficult to figure it out. But based on the video of True Promise 2 that Abadi took, about 18 Arrow 3s were used to defend against the missile attack on October 1st. And then adding to that the 34 missile defense intercept or Arrow 3 interceptors that we can kind of confirm being used on video during the 12-day war, that puts us in the ballpark of 50 missile Arrow 3s confirmed to have been used during the course of the kind of tit for tat missile strikes. Again, we put together a kind of higher estimate of expenditure by pegging it to THAAD. So if it was being expended at 34 Arrow 3s for 39 THAADs, then if we expound that out to what U.S. officials said that interceptor expenditures were, then maybe 130 Arrow 3s would have been used. Unfortunately, we don't know how deep the Israeli magazine is. Unsurprisingly, the Israelis are really reticent to speak to that. But the Wall Street Journal was able to get U.S. officials to say that the Israelis were really running low. They were starting to run out, and they had to start husbanding them, was the word that they used. So I think that towards the end of the conflict, especially, the Israelis were kind of scraping the bottom of the barrel. And I think that this is one of the reasons why they were more amenable to a ceasefire, right? They were calling for additional transfers of interceptors, and I think that they were worried that if the war continued, the Iranians might be able to continue generating strikes against Israel that would start defeating missile defenses and really, really wreaking additional damage on Israeli society. And so I think the sensitivity to that inflection point where Israeli defenses were no longer able to compete with the sustained Iranian missile strikes, I think that sensitivity likely encouraged the Israeli acceptance of the ceasefire when they did.
And then let's close my questions before I turn to some from the audience. When we look at, I think we should talk through the variants. So THAAD is operated by the U.S. Army and is based on the ground, obviously, or the earth, where the SM-3 is operated by the Navy, which is at sea in the Mediterranean there. How are you able to peg sort of production rates of SM-3 and THAAD for your analysis? I mean, I know how you do it, but perhaps for the audience.
Yeah, this is helpfully again, like the Wall Street Journal did really good reporting on this issue, and that made a lot of my analysis super helpful. But on one side is the reporting. The Wall Street Journal said that U.S. officials said that the stockpile was about 600 THAAD interceptors. Um, and uh, this is complex because we're also selling THAAD to other countries, and so there are exports to be considered. But by looking at budget documents that the Missile Defense Agency puts out, they'll tell you how many missile defense interceptors they're producing for each variant each year. So there was one year a couple years ago, I think 2019, where like 100 THAAD interceptors were produced in one year. And by tracking those budget documents, we're able to get a sense of overall, how many of these interceptors have been made, how many are available. For SM-3, it's a little bit more complicated. Over time, there have been three different variants of the SM-3 interceptor that have been produced: the Block 1A, the Block 1B, and then the Block 2A. The Block 2A, which is produced in partnership with Japan. And since in the past couple of years, the Block 1A interceptor has been phased out. It's just older, it's not as effective, and the motors are starting to age. And so those have been retired, leaving just the SM-3 Block 1B and Block 2A available. And production for the Block 1B actually ceased a while back, though there was another order recently. Procurement is hard, and actually, I would really recommend the work of the CSIS Missile Defense Project in kind of keeping tabs on what is being produced in what numbers and when. I found their work to be super useful on this. But by kind of using budget documents and then available reporting, we're able to see what production rates are, and then that allows us to make determinations about what cuts this engagement made into U.S. stockpiles. Because if you're using up a quarter of your THAAD interceptors and your SM-3 interceptors in 12 days of conflict against the like frankly not exquisite Iranian missile force, what does that suggest about the ability of U.S. missile defenses to stand up to perhaps a more prolonged conflict against the People's Liberation Army rocket force in East Asia? Especially given the kind of large numbers of intermediate range missiles that they have and the small numbers of interceptors available in places like Guam.
Yeah, I mean, one of the major, and then what I would add to that is when we put together the defense budget every year, one of the places where you can steal money from to pay for other things, right, is in resupply of your magazine, right? So it's the buying of munitions, as part of the allocation of whatever the overall number is, 900 billion or so,
Yeah.
in terms of this. And they do publish nice costs, how much each thing costs towards the back end of the defense budget. But with that, I'm going to turn over to some of the questions from the audience, talking about that Israeli missile defeat strategy. So one of the questions is did they strike sort of command and control nodes or radars? One you would expect to think about to make your air campaign, I guess, less risky, for prolonged flight operations over a hostile country.
Yeah, so the Israelis did a number of things that ended up being very effective and kind of helped us out. Well, I guess one thing they didn't do was that the Assad regime collapsed, and that allowed them basically free overflights over Syria. So they didn't have to worry about Syrian air defenses trying to interdict them as they were moving to and from Iran. So I think that's one kind of external factor that makes this campaign easier for the Israelis. But then a couple of other things that they did was starting to attrite those kind of higher tier Russian systems that the Iranians had gotten a hold of. So there were a bunch of stories about this. There's some really fabulous satellite imagery that came out after the Israeli retaliation for True Promise 1, where you can see some of those S-300 radars just totally destroyed. One outside of Isfahan was, I think, the most notable target. So kind of attriting those and making sure that those higher tier systems aren't able to compete with you. I think that was kind of a really important part of this. The command and control disruption is not to be kind of dismissed, and I think the Israelis achieved this. The strikes on kind of Iranian military leadership at the very opening of the war definitely complicated Iran's ability to retaliate. I think there are a lot of elements of the attacks on command and control, especially there was rumors about a cyber attack, but from the open source side, the kind of consequence is quite clear, which is that it took the Iranians almost an entire day to field their first retaliatory strike after the Israeli air campaign started. And I think that speaks to kind of how disrupted Iranian command and control networks were, and that probably also inhibited their air defense performance. But again, these are things that we don't have super good insight to because you're trying to prove a negative in some sense. But I think the decapitation of a lot of Iranian senior military leadership combined with whatever else was going on behind the scenes, made this very difficult. In addition to the kind of physical destruction of a lot of hardware using things like drones and just old-fashioned seed.
And so one of the other questions is, basically, I'm going to twist it a little bit, but the performance of Iranian air defense systems beyond the S-300. And you, as part of this paper, which I'll promote again, Shallow Ramparts, which you can get a link in the chat box there. You and the team had also done some work from open source indications on Iranian air defense. So perhaps explain that and sort of what you were able to infer from videos that Iranians took themselves.
Yeah, this work provoked a kind of strong negative reaction from the Iranians. I think a day or two after it ended up being published in Breaking Defense, and a day or two afterwards, the Iranian general staff issued a statement on video. They were all assembled together. They issued a statement saying that Iran's air defenses were actually quite effective, which did not turn out to be true. But on the anniversary of True Promise 1, the Iranians released what I can only describe as a sizzle reel of footage from the drone launches and the missile launches and the impacts in Israel. And as part of this, they also released about just under 2 seconds of footage from what we ended up figuring out was an air defense command center. We initially thought it might be like a drone management site, but we ended up realizing that it was showing a bunch of different radar screens, and that those radar screens correlated with the physical location of a bunch of air defense systems. So we were able to geolocate the air defenses associated with the images on the screen, and it ended up being Natanz, which was pretty surprising for us. And one thing that surprised us was that the early warning systems that we saw, the kind of long range search radars depicted on the radar screens we were looking at, ended up being Iranian domestic copies of Soviet spoon rest type radars. So like this is like very old stuff that the Iranians have been kind of replicating and updating themselves, and that those feeds weren't plugging into the actual the shooters, right? The surface to air missile systems, and which themselves were based on copies of the US SM-2 surface to air missile. So, right, it's all copies all the way down, and it's copies from really different origins, right? You have Soviet radars talking to Iranian radars launching copies of American SAMs. This ends up being like, I think, probably very difficult to integrate in a functional way. And so I think that this disjuncture between early warning and then queuing for your surface air missiles, I think that probably made the Iranians' job harder in ways that they definitely did not need at the start of the war. So I think that that's part of it as well. And yeah, the Iranians were not pleased about this work, but I think we ended up being proven right by events.
I'm going to try and take another question from the audience here, which is it's actually a tough one. For the U.S., it's a little easier, but it's about the ability to replenish the stockpile of THAAD or SM-3. You can see allocations in the defense budget for these if we ever get a defense budget, if the government decides to reopen. But if you had to sort of make inferences or guesses about on the, let's say, the Iranian side, about how much time they need to replenish their own missile stockpiles, how do you see both sides playing out here in terms of rearmament?
Yeah, so we recently published a really great analysis done by mostly by one of our summer interns who did really excellent work, Carl Parkin. And Carl's analysis suggested that once the Iranians basically recapitalize key parts of their missile production infrastructure, particularly things like planetary mixers that are used to mix solid propellant, kind of like cake batter before you pour it into casting pits. The Iranians could return to producing as many as 200 missiles per month. And that's a lot of missiles. Indeed, the kind of ever increasing Iranian missile production capacity is one of the reasons that Netanyahu cited as being why this time was kind of right for the Israelis to strike. And So I think once a couple of kind of key pieces of equipment return to Iran, they're going to be able to really start churning out ballistic missiles again in pretty high volumes. We also saw recently this week there were CNN reports about uh, Chinese shipments of sodium perchlorate arriving in Iran, which is kind of the building block for ammonium perchlorate, which is what you use to make solid propellant. So the Iranians are taking active steps to rebuild their missile program, and they're going to be able to make kind of very large numbers of missiles again soon, despite the kind of Israeli attacks on a bunch of different parts of that production infrastructure. And I think that it's going to be really difficult for missile defense production and procurement to keep pace with that. There are some steps that the U.S. has taken. They're ordered a bunch of SM-3 Block 1Bs again. My understanding is they're attempting to open additional production lines for THAAD. But I think fundamentally, you have this issue where the missile defense interceptors that you're making are much more expensive and difficult to produce in terms of the technology required than the ballistic missiles, right? The kind of fanciest parts of ballistic missiles, the electronics required, those are things that were mastered in, the 1970s and are not that complicated. Whereas missile defense interceptors are much more demanding, right? If you're intercepting in space, like the Arrow 3 or the SM-3, you're going to need a fancy infrared sensor. If even if you're intercepting in the atmosphere like THAAD, you're going to need all sorts of more sophisticated radar fusing. And while the U.S. and Israel certainly have vastly more resources than the Iranians do, I wouldn't be surprised if the Iranians were able to outpace U.S. defensive interceptor production with offensive missile production. I think that's one of the fundamental tensions with regional missile defense is that it's easier for the offense to oversaturate the defenses than it is for defenses to build up. Though again, we're seeing positive signs from the U.S. and others, right? Production is expanding. There's renewed attention to this. But nevertheless, I think the kind of the fundamental realities of kind of production and cost are on the Iranian side.
And that's not a particularly controversial finding. That has been the finding, sort of the offense defense balance from anybody who's done these cost exchange calculations. I mean, basically forever, right? Is that the cost of defense is far higher than offense. And so if I were to sort of step back and ask a broader question, I think one of the advantages the Israelis have is that they have brought down the cost of offense considerably. The types of munitions that they're using for these longer range strikes do cost less than their U.S. equivalents. Sometimes they are their U.S. equivalents, but they built their own infrastructure as well. So if you were to put these together, where do you see trends going, like in the region, particularly in this offense defense balance, and how we should think about missile defense as a tool rather than as sort of a panacea to stop or protect large population centers?
I find it really troubling, and I think that putting these things together is super useful for understanding kind of where these are going. Um, if you have defenses that are kind of difficult to produce, that are exquisite, and even if they work really well, right? And that's I think one thing that has been demonstrated aptly by the True Promise operations is that Israeli regional missile defenses are quite capable against the Iranian threat. Um, However, if you're unable to keep pace with offensive missile production, that's going to start pushing you in a more aggressive direction, right? If you are kind of fundamentally uncomfortable with the vulnerability that the Iranian ballistic missile force creates, then you're going to need to take more and more often or more and more frequent offensive action. This is why I think the missile production justification that Netanyahu gives is so troubling, is that it suggests that maybe this could happen again. And so I think the missile defeat strategy, while very successful, is perhaps not sustainable in the long term without additional conflict.
And I guess this allows us to expand it out region wide. One of the things that I mean, again, this has been a proposal on the table from various think tanks for as long as I've been doing research. It's one of the questions that came up here, which is that the U.S. spearheading I think, what's called a hub and spokes approach, which is more integrated regional air and missile defense to counter the Iranian ballistic missile threat. So it's not just Israel, but it's also, forward deployments in Qatar, in Saudi Arabia, Jordan. You could just keep going down the lines. We talked a lot about the inability to integrate Iranian air defenses. How would you say we do in terms of integrating air and missile defenses, even amongst allies? Can the two sides talk to each other? Can THAAD and Patriot talk to each other?
These are great questions, and I think that for some of this, I'm definitely out of my depth. But I think some things that I do feel comfortable speaking about is that it seems like Israeli and U.S. defenses are pretty well integrated. The THAAD battery in Israel seemed to do really well, and the kind of coordination between SM-3 and Israeli defenses seem to also work pretty well. But again, I don't have any particular insight into this. It's just there were not very many impacts in Israel after the war, and it seemed like all of these elements were pretty simpatico. Similarly, the Patriot batteries in Qatar at Al Udeid performed really well against the kind of salutary Iranian retaliation after Midnight Hammer. So these things seem to be working pretty well in isolation. But I have no sense about whether or how they can play nice together in a more integrated environment. That's definitely that's out of the scope of my knowledge, unfortunately.
I'll just say they have trouble. Let's just say that they don't talk to each other. So they may have like an integrated plan, right? But each individual operator is sort of operating independent of the other, even if it's in support of the same goal,
Yeah.
right? So you're perhaps not optimizing your fire rate when you're coming out of this. So that would be a good lesson learned, which is better open architecture on software between these different suppliers. Because Aero, I believe, is Boeing and Israeli Aerospace, and THAAD is Lockheed and Raytheon, or RTC now. Anyways, another question here that we'll get to is, sometimes there is speculation that, particularly during True Promise, is that the Iranians didn't want the attack to succeed, or that they wanted to sort of calibrate the potential negative outcomes to try and control escalation. You know, I've always been skeptical of this argument, because you don't throw 120 ballistic missiles at somebody and just hope that they don't work. It seems like you're trying to get through defenses. Perhaps run us through your thought process on early warning, signs or visibility that the Israelis or the US could pick up from the Iranians that would suggest imminent launch.
Yeah, so I think that actually the kind of calibrated escalation strategy question is super interesting, and I find myself actually falling on more on the side that I think the Iranians did pursue a more calibrated strategy with True Promise 1 and then True Promise 2. And I think that we can see this in both strike composition and targeting, right? So there was more early warning associated with True Promise 1 because of the cruise missile and drone launches. And I'd be surprised if the Iranians think that that wouldn't be detected. Um, However, I think that the targeting element of this is really important. Both in True Promise 1 and in True Promise 2, the focus of the ballistic missile attacks were military targets, specifically Nevatim Air Base, which is quite isolated. And even though especially in True Promise 2, it gets hit by about 32 ballistic missiles, it doesn't really produce any serious casualties, especially civilian casualties. And so I think that that's one way that the Iranians were attempting to kind of control or manage escalation, was by focusing on military targets, which would reduce the kind of pressure on the Israeli government to react more strongly. Um, I agree with you that you don't throw 120 or 200 ballistic missiles at something without trying to hit it. And there's one of the reasons why I think that Nevatim was the focus is because it's the F-35 base for the Israelis. And the F-35s were what were used to destroy the consulate in Damascus So you have this nice kind of linkage there, right? I think the Iranians call it attacking the threat or the target at the source. Um, and so they were trying to kind of send a message that this is unacceptable behavior. We will attempt to attrite the tools that you have used to do the unacceptable behavior. Though it clearly didn't work very well for them. And I don't think any F-35s were damaged in the conduct of those operations. Um, but as far as like indicators that the Iranians would be gearing up for something else, uh, I think that I think it's hard on one level. Paying attention to what people say is important, right? I think the Iranians often end up signaling quite clearly in public statements, their intention or their displeasure with things, especially in kind of the lead up to True Promise 1 and 2. They were quite clear in saying, these actions are unacceptable and there will be consequences. So I think listening to what they have to say is worth doing. Um, from a more kind of technical perspective, looking at activities at the missile cities, especially the intermediate range ones, that's a useful indicator. And then on a more kind of micro level, like space-based infrared assets are great for identifying those missile launches, but that's at a point where kind of strategic warning is not quite as useful anymore. So, or the opportunity for strategic warning has passed.
I guess this will be the last question, then we can wrap up here, is that we talked a lot about missile defense. One of the things that I came away with from this conflict is conventionally armed ballistic missiles just aren't a very good weapon, when you're thinking about precise military effect. The challenges with striking Nevatim Air Base is that when you have enough warning, you can remove aircraft from Nevatim Air Base. And it's actually really hard to destroy air bases because they're large, and concrete's pretty cheap. You just fill in the holes, right? That could take a couple hours, could take a couple days, but you can get things up and running again. I think the Ukrainians are a good example of that. But can you talk us through perhaps your broad meta thinking about the ballistic missile as a weapon of war as we close out this conversation?
I think the the takeaway that I've had from looking at especially Nevatim over the kind of rounds of missile conflict is, yeah, similar to your point. Conventional missiles are a weapon that struggle frequently, and more so than people often make them out to. Um, that being said, I think the Iranians face kind of limitations in the quality of their missile force, right? Their missiles aren't nearly as accurate as they claim to be, and that inaccuracy generates a lot of difficulty for actually doing damage to targets like Nevatim. Um, that being said, right, I totally agree with you on all this stuff. Concrete's pretty cheap. Reinforced concrete is also relatively cheaper than a ballistic missile. During True Promise 2, one of the Israeli F-35 shelters at Nevatim just eats a ballistic missile on the roof, and it doesn't seem to do that much damage. Again, like concrete's relatively easy to patch. And so one of the kind of lessons I've taken from this is uh, accuracy is kind of at a premium for if you are using ballistic missiles conventionally, but that accuracy becomes much harder to get at intermediate and medium ranges than short ranges, right? We can see the delta between the precision with which the Iranians were able to strike Ain al-Assad Air Base in Iraq versus their ability to accurately target Nevatim. And there are a bunch of different reasons why this is, but fundamentally, the longer you're flying, the more inaccuracy is going to build up in your guidance system. Another thing might be GPS denial or jamming, especially if those missiles are relying on commercial GPS chips. And we've seen a ton of GPS jamming and spoofing in Israel. So the one of the lessons I've taken away from this is that while it's clear that active defenses are super useful and are pretty effective, actually, um, one way to kind of ease the strain on production lines and make it easier to keep up is passive defenses. So things like additional aircraft shelters, larger air bases, taxiways that you can take off from, additional runway repair kits, additional staff to use those runway repair kits. I think all of these things would be very useful to ensure that air bases in an Indo-Pacific context or a Middle East context, a European context, can continue to operate during a conflict. So like larger and larger air bases, more runways, that kind of resilience, I think, would be a good way to invest some dollars. Because yeah, I totally agree. This is one of the problems I have with discourse about the Russian Oreshnik missile. Is I'm not sure quite how effective it would be for really denying NATO air bases, considering how limited the damage of conventional ballistic missiles is against targets like this.
And with that, we are rehashing Cold War assessments that I could read going back to 1960, far beyond that, which is air-based vulnerability to both conventional, biological, chemical, and nuclear attack, and hardening procedures to prepare against that. But that is a different conversation for a different day. So with that, Sam, I want to thank you for doing the paper. The link is in the webinar chat. There are more to come in the next couple of weeks, and we will combine all of these papers into a single edited volume, which we will make available to everybody for free. And so with that, Sam, thank you for joining us from the West Coast, and thank you everybody for joining and paying attention during this webinar. Have a good rest of your day.
Thanks, Aaron. Thanks for having me.